Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the MACS podcast. My name is Steve Schaeber. I'm the Manager of Service Training for MACS, the Mobile Air Climate Systems Association. And I'm here today with Peter Coll, President and COO of the association. Hello, Peter.
Good afternoon. It's a beautiful day here outside of Philadelphia.
Beautiful day in Lansdale.
75 and sunny, and finally the rain's gone.
Yep.
I'm excited.
So today for our podcast, I thought we would discuss a topic that's come front and center to our little sector of the air conditioning industry, and that's the U.S. AIM Act of 2020. But of course, we're not going to discuss the entire AIM Act.
No.
That would take more time than we have.
Because it's like thousands of pages.
Thousands of pages. But what I wanted to do specifically was talk about a new rule, a proposed rule that EPA put out back in December of 2022. So as part of this new rule, this NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, EPA is making a big push to get rid of R134A.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about that. What are they doing and why are they doing it?
Well, back in 2006, the Europeans decided that 134A was bad for the environment and that they were going to get rid of it. So by what was supposed to be 2011 ended up being 2017 or something like that. The Europeans said, can't use 134A in a mobile air conditioning system, can only use something other than that or less, global warming potential of less than 150.
So they didn't tell us what we had to use,
no.
Just that we had to use something else.
That's correct.
Right.
We couldn't use 134A. And so that was, we commonly refer to that as the GWP 150 rule. And so finally in December, the US decided, hey, we kind of like that rule, let's put that rule in place. And it makes kind of sense because here in the US, we've been using an alternate to 134A or 1234YF for a number of years, primarily in light duty cars and trucks. And they've now said, we're now going to make it a rule that effective, and there's a date schedule associated, which I'm sure we'll get to, but there's between 2025, 2026, 2027, somewhere in there, that not only can I not use 134A in light duty passenger vehicles and light duty pickup trucks, but I also can't use it in other applications, medium and heavy duty.
Right.
And that's really the big change. We're accustomed to 1234YF in the passenger car market. That's kind of the catch-22 here is we need to get those folks moving along so that they can comply with the rule. But remember, it is just a notice of proposed rulemaking. It's not a rule yet. So they gave everybody till, I don't know, roughly the end of January to make comments.
Right. January 30th, I think, was the date in the NPRM.
Lots of comments. I don't think anybody's super pushing back against doing it. I think the bigger pushback is against the time frame in which they need to do it.
Yeah, that's mostly what I heard from our members in the heavy duty industry. So what we call heavy duty, the off-highway and ConAg, construction and agriculture.
Yep.
It's not that they're opposed to doing it, they actually went on their own and asked the EPA for permission to use YF in their vehicles.
Right.
Which that whole process actually went pretty smoothly.
Sure.
But then when EPA came out with this NPRM, kind of took everyone by surprise, like, hey, wait a minute, we weren't planning on this.
Right.
And you know how it is in manufacturing, everything goes by plan.
Right.
So I think the timing was just probably could have been discussed a little bit better to find out what can actually be done in the factories, in the assembly lines around the country to make that process go a little bit smoother.
Yeah, I think that'll be the challenge is the timing. It's not they don't want to do it. It's not the technology is super different.
Right.
It's really just design changes. How long does it take to move that rock, if you will? If we're talking about one of those big trucks that's hauling rocks out of a mine or something like that, how long does it take to move these vehicles along and do appropriate designs and do all of the related safety surveys the safety tests, the risk assessments to make sure that, that they design the systems properly.
Right.
And this is one of the, what I'll call the three-headed monster related to this. And we're not going to get into too much into the other two, but it's important to kind of touch on them. One is the allocation rules for 134A, about reducing the available supply of 134A over time. And then the second one is looking at making sure that we recapture and we make the best use of HFCs or 134A that are already in the market so that we can extend the supply as long as we can. Even though they're trying to get rid of it, they recognize there's some need to have it for some period of time. And so those are the three things: the reduction in supply, the recapturing of as much as we can, and what we're talking about today is the GWP 150 rule.
Right, the phase down part.
Yeah.
Right. So we put out a MACS blog back at the end of last year that kind of covered this topic. And in here it has a list of what the different vehicles were. So what each subsector of our industry, what each of those subsectors are, and when they're going to be, when this rule would apply to them.
Right.
So on the light duty side, in my view, it kind of, this rule is EPA telling the light duty manufacturers that now you're going to be required by law to do what you're already doing. Because like you said, we already changed over to YF on these vehicles back 2015,
Right.
pretty much.
Right.
So these vehicles are already using it. So basically, F-150s, 1500 pickups, on down to small passenger cars, they're basically already changed over.
But it's important to know why they're already using it. Partly because there's a European rule, but partly because they were getting CAFE credits to be able to use 1234YF kind of in the beginning. And I think the NPRM makes those CAFE credits go away. And it basically says this is mandatory now that you'll have to do it. And you're not going to be able to do it just because you're getting credits. But I think everybody would stay with it anyway, even without the credits.
Yeah, that's what I heard. There was a meeting down at EPA, I don't know, 5 years ago or something like that. And it was actually during the time when one of EPA's prior rules was challenged in court.
Yeah.
And the discussion came up of, you know, well, if we don't have this mandatory rule in place, which says you can't use HFCs after 2021, well, then everyone's going to switch back to using HFCs instead of using YF.
Right, especially if they get rid of the CAFE credits.
Well, that was the whole thing.
Yeah.
One of the manufacturers said, no, we're not going to switch back because this rule, this 2021 rule,
Right.
It's not the reason why we're doing it. We're doing it for the CAFE credits.
Right.
That was where, I guess, if you want to put it, that's where the money was for the car OEs.
That's right.
Right.
Right, right. And the systems are so similar that they had determined and they had infrastructure there already, because at that point in time, when those rules were being challenged in DC, the majority of car manufacturers were still making some cars with 134A. And of course, we've seen that go away as we've often talked about going to the Philly car show and so forth, that you would only see things that started with a 2, like an F250 or 350 or a Silverado 2500 that still had 134A. Everything else had been shifted over.
Right. And that is a good segue into our next subcategory of vehicles, medium duty. So medium duty passenger vehicles, heavy duty trucks, but not on-road truck, heavy duty pickup trucks, complete vans.
You mean not off-road trucks?
Not off-road, but also not on-road. Not heavy duty on-road like
Class 8s.
Class 7, Class 8 tractor trailers.
Yep.
Class 6 dump trucks,
Right.
School buses, big heavy duty vehicles. Those aren't included in this particular part of the rule. But again, 5 or 6 years ago, some of these vehicle manufacturers applied to EPA to get SNAP approval.
Sure.
Basically the thought pattern back then was, well, if I'm building F1, say, use Ford for an example.
Yep.
If I'm building the F-150 on the same assembly line as the F-250, same assembly line as the F-350,
Yep.
To do that, I have to have two completely different, separate air conditioning charging stations, one for 134A and one for YF.
Right.
And they wanted the option
Yep.
to use one or the other.
Yep.
So they applied for it, they got SNAP approval, but they never actually switched the vehicle lines over.
Right.
They kept building F-150s or 1,500 pickup trucks with YF while they're still using 134A in those medium-duty trucks.
Yeah, but they had the approval. And once they had the approval, that allowed them to determine what design differences they might need, which really wasn't anything significant between a 150 and a 250 for an air conditioning system.
Yeah, they're basically the same.
But what design differences they need so that they would be ready when the time came and they were ready to switch or they were being pushed to switch, which is a little bit different than those other classes of vehicles where those manufacturers generally weren't manufacturing anything with 1234YF. And while they'd kind of pushed to get SNAP approval for the refrigerant, they really didn't have a baseline to start with. And so they have a lot of infrastructure they have to work with.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so now this rule, the proposal is that they're going to require not using HFCs in these medium-duty trucks and these limited types of heavy-duty pickup trucks. Mm-hmm. So basically, they applied for it, they got permission, they never switched. Now EPA is going to make them switch over to YF.
Yeah, and I'm always fascinated by the concept of medium duty because out where I live, out in Amish land, first of all, note, Amish horse and buggies are not listed as requiring to change away from 134A.
Do they have air conditioning?
They do. They have,
really?
They have that 8-mile-an-hour air conditioning where they
have.
kind of roll the windows down, right? But out where I am, an F-250 is a passenger car. I mean, it's not a work truck.
They're so common.
It's so common, right? So I don't think that change for those folks is going to be a difficult challenge at all. Yeah. But there are some folks that are concerned, and I think you dive into that world a little bit. We were having a conversation the other day about folks who have a model, and that model or model year really isn't a model year.
Right.
It's like we make the same dump truck for 15 years.
Right. That's actually a little bit further down in the list here. So we basically, this blog, we covered the 5 different subsectors that are addressed in this NPRM. So you got passenger cars. We know most of them are already switched over anyway, so not really a big deal. But the rule says that by 2025 model year, which basically starts in 6 months, right, in the middle of 24.
Yeah, for most people, sure.
You're going to have to switch those over.
Yep.
Medium duty pickup trucks, I think this was the same year, 2025. This is the class of vehicles you're talking about. So construction and agriculture.
Yeah.
Because they applied on their own. The ConAg group applied for 5, actually further 5 subsectors of different types of agricultural and construction equipment to be approved. So I forget what all the categories were. It was like, small tractors, tractors under 40 horsepower, of course, tractors over 40 horsepower, construction equipment. So, like this windrower here, this got approved to use YF back in 2018. But that rule became final in 2021. Well, they never changed the lines over.
Right.
They just wanted to be allowed to do it, kind of like Ford and GM and Chrysler and Nissan. They wanted to be allowed to use YF in their medium-duty trucks.
But one of the things that's interesting is we speak kind of a different language than some other folks, and we have a lot of friends who speak at a level that's like way up here compared to us. But it wasn't really the vehicle that got approved. It was the application that got approved. Right. So you don't have to apply to have your particular vehicle, your Silverado 2500 approved. It's medium duty as a class. And in this case, this class and then this subclass was approved to use 1234YF.
Right.
So each manufacturer didn't have to go to apply for their vehicle. They just said, hey, we fall into this class. It's already been approved for this class. we're good to go when we want to go.
Right, and I think what you're talking about is more like what the vehicle manufacturers do with highway safety.
Yeah.
Where every model, not every model, every platform has to
go through all the rigorous testing. And they don't have to do that in this case. They just kind of group them all together and they say, hey, look, if you're a school bus, doesn't matter who's making you. You're a school bus, you fall into that category. This refrigerant's allowed to be used in your application.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually one of the categories that's being worked on right now, which is not part of this notice of proposed rulemaking. But I guess if you look at the whole of mobile air conditioning, so we already have passenger cars, we already have medium duty trucks, we already have this farm equipment. We already have these 5 subsectors that are approved, but like the last paragraph says, there's not yet been a proposal to limit the use of HFCs in other types of HD vehicles. Mm-hmm. So class 4 through 8, it's not allowed. Right. You're not allowed to use YF in that. Also buses, so your large transit buses, school buses, mm-hmm. and specialty vehicles. You're not allowed to use YF in those right mm-hmm. now, mm-hmm. but there's 2 studies going on, 2 SNAP approval projects. One that's for class 4 through 8 vehicles, and that work is being done through a consortium of those manufacturers trying to get approval. So think of like Daimler trucks, yep. right? Freightliner. Those manufacturers are looking to get those SNAP approvals done so they can use YF in those trucks.
Right.
And I think that's the group that's going to slice out school buses. Mm-hmm. Transit buses haven't been looked at yet. So there's a third yet category that has to be worked on.
But my experience with some of those transit buses is some of them were running R22 systems, some of them were running like 407F systems. And you have to remember that you've got some of those vehicles, and I'm no expert in this category, you know a lot more than I do, that's for sure. But they have 2 separate systems. They might have a system that's running a compressor off of the engine, and then they have a secondary system that's like a rooftop system or something that's doing a lot of passenger cooling there.
Right.
And so some of those applications haven't been qualified, but they also aren't running 134A. They're running 407F or some other
or 22, like you said,
refrigerant out there. Steve, I don't know if we have time, but if you just do a quick search on EPA 150 space GWP, maybe we can pull up that document, the fact sheet maybe there, and scroll. I think you go down, you can see a chart. And I wanted to show the chart because...
The consumption chart?
No, not the consumption chart. I think it's, the rule chart. So scroll back up and just kind of go all the way to the top right there. Yep. So this doesn't just cover cars.
Right, exactly.
Or motor vehicles or transport. You'll look at industrial process refrigeration systems, retail food refrigeration. And when you look at the proposed GWP limit, it's important because depending on how you count your beans or what year you count your beans, 134A's GWP is somewhere between 1,310 and 1,510 or
depending
something.
On when they calculated it.
Yeah, when they calculated it. But way outside the limits. So some of these are 150, some of these are 300, some of them are other numbers like 700 and so forth. But it goes down to retail food refrigeration, vending machines, cold storage warehouses.
Even ice
rinks are covered.
Yeah.
Right. And then when you continue going down, you'll get eventually to, there's residential and light commercial air conditioning and heat pump systems. Talk about a big one there, right? That's that system that's bolted onto the side of your house, and they've got a 700 limit. And
well, that makes me wonder. I mean, if their limit now is going to be 700, what was the GWP of the refrigerant they were using before that?
Well, I think I'm not positive if 410A falls into that category or not, just because I don't know enough about that topic. But now we get to vehicle light duty and so forth, right, kind of at the bottom of this. And then that gives us that chart with the proposed dates.
Right.
Not the dates, but the proposed
Proposed dates, right.
Proposed
because one of the things I heard, and this is again going to the con ag manufacturers. So I mean, to put it plainly, you know, the thought from some of those manufacturers is that they asked for approval and they got it, and then EPA came out and gave them a mandated date of when they had to change.
Correct.
And what they would have liked to have happen was if a little bit of prior notice was put out there saying, here's what we're thinking, do you think this would work or not?
Right.
Just have a little bit of dialogue, because I don't think they're far off. Mm-hmm. So if you look here on the chart, so EPA says that you know, motor vehicle air conditioning for non-road vehicles, that's how they call, you know, farm tractors.
Right.
GWP limit of 150 by model year 2026. So you got two things there. First of all, that type of equipment doesn't use model years. They may, like you said earlier, they may build the same D10 dozer for 18 years.
Right.
You know, they don't change that often.
Right.
So that's one thing. But you know, so they have to change their whole assembly line, not the whole line, but they have to change the air conditioning charging station. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, in a lot of these vehicle assembly plants, they're not using a charge cart like we use in the shop. Mm-hmm. Not to say that some of them don't do that, because I've seen them use, I'll just say it, I've seen them use Robinair charge carts
right.
on the assembly line to charge some of these, you know, very slow production vehicles. But a lot of them have fully installed AC charging stations like what you would see in an automotive assembly plant.
Or which can be part of a fluid filling station.
A fluid filling station, right.
It's not just AC, it just happens to have a connection for AC, and it might be filling oil, it might be filling, you know, any number of other things. Coolant, brake fluid. Especially things where they want to pull a vacuum so that they don't have any air in the system, and then, you know, pump it in there fast and so forth.
And that equipment's very expensive. And to change it over from one refrigerant to another, it's not as simple as disconnecting the one can, bringing in your new refrigerant, and hooking it up.
Right. And as far as I recall, they're not using your basic 4.5 kg or 10-pound YF can filling those things up, right? They've got bigger installations of fluid tanks somewhere on the property.
Yeah.
And so then they have a whole set of OSHA regulations they have to deal with, and environmental regulations for installing things like that. So if they don't have that process started, that's really what's going to take a long time, is to get all that set up, not really the design of the system. Not the design of the system, and probably even not the labor, you know, the installation of the pipes, and actually running of the lines and bringing the new cylinders over. It's going to be all that paperwork, the architecture and the paperwork, and all the environmental and the safety, because now you're talking, I mean, I know like in the vehicle assembly plants, you know, they have isotainers. So how many pounds of refrigerants are in an isotainer? Right. Thousands. And so much easier for the automotive guys, the light duty guys, because they already have that. Even if they have separate filling lines or separate, you know, diverting lines for their medium duty from their light duty, that tank is on site already. They already have it. They've already gone through all that heavy lifting, if you will. All the safety and the paperwork. Correct, right. With either their local government or their state government, you know, that they might have to deal with. Right. So I think, you know, just in my conversations, I think that if the proposal maybe was for 2027, and if it was a built as of date instead of by a model year, I think that just would have gone over a little better. And I know that there were some comments made back to EPA during the comment period to that effect. So now we're in this what would you call, like, you know, the quiet period. So EPA puts out their notice, and then 45 some odd days later you have your comment period. And then you have the quiet time where EPA can't comment, and you really can't comment to them, you know.
So we're waiting for them to write it and put out their proposed rule.
Correct.
And then a second comment period will open after that.
Correct. And so, I expect, and I don't know, I don't have any personal knowledge other than my experience with some of the EPA folks. They're not unreasonable in these cases.
No, not at all.
They may look at it and say, we didn't realize you had didn't have model years associated with all these. So we could modify the rule and it might say model year 2026 no later than January 1st, 2026.
Right.
So if you are using model years, then you have to comply with that, but no later than January 1st, 2026. So we don't know what that rule is going to look like, but it could be a modification, something like that, that kind of gives everybody a little more clarity.
Yeah, that's what I think we're going to end up with too, because, in reality, EPA doesn't really want to push these things on us without us, meaning the industry, without us having the dialogue and the conversations with them. It's you know how it is. It's much easier to work together. So that's how I think it's going to go.
And it may not be 1234YF. No, I think it is. I mean, at least today, I think it is. That's
today, right?
Because it's you have to remember the rule says global warming potential greater than 150, and we mentioned it earlier. We're not going to tell you what to use. We're going to tell you what we can't use.
Right. Well, that's a great topic for another MACS podcast when we talk about future refrigerants.
And one of our favorite words, PFAS.
PFAS, yeah, that's another one.
PFAS, which neither you nor I are experts on. Maybe that would be a great podcast to get one of our more involved PFAS friends.
Yeah, someone who's a little bit closer to the subject, especially what's going on in Europe.
Put their big face on the screen, maybe
have them right here in the room with us. Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah.
Anyway. So hey, Peter, thanks for hanging out with me today.
Steve, it's always a pleasure. Glad to be here with you. So I'm Peter Coll.
And I'm Steve Schaeber, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers.
All right, cool. I think that's a wrap.